Welcome to the Biblical Wisdom Channel.
Have you ever imagined a single angel defeating 185,000 soldiers in one night? This story, recorded in the Bible, is one of the most astounding displays of God's power in action. The city of Jerusalem was under siege, and the Assyrian army seemed unbeatable. But while men placed their trust in swords and strategies, King Hezekiah put his trust in the Lord, and he responded in a supernatural way. This narrative is not just a historical account. It's a living message that God is in control, even in the face of the most impossible situations. What's even more amazing is that this same God continues to work in the lives of those who trust in Him. Let's explore together what happened that night, the role of Hezekiah, and how this divine intervention offers eternal lessons for our lives today. I want to tell you that you are incredibly special to God, and I created this video with great love and care. I'm so happy to contribute to strengthening your faith. I kindly ask that you show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing this message. Your act of love can help many people find the only path to salvation. Together, we can comfort the hearts of those who are struggling and in need of a word of hope. Did you know that God, the creator of everything, cares about every detail of your life? Since ancient times, He has revealed Himself as the one who protects, guides, and intervenes in the history of His people. One of the most striking examples of this is the story of Hezekiah, a king who, in the midst of chaos, witnessed God's hand delivering Jerusalem from destruction. This narrative is not just a distant memory. It echoes the living promise of Psalm 46 verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Imagine this: Jerusalem surrounded by an enemy army, an entire nation on the brink of collapse. The Assyrians were feared, known for their cruelty and military might. Any human king would likely have succumbed to despair, but not Hezekiah. He knew his strength did not come from the city's walls or the size of his army, but from an unshakable trust in the God who had promised to fight for His people. What about you? Have you ever faced moments when everything seemed lost? Hezekiah did something many of us forget. He took his concerns directly to God. He entered the temple, tore his clothes as a sign of humility, and prayed fervently. Isn't this exactly what the Bible teaches us to do? Philippians 4 verse 6 reminds us, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Now, think about this. If God was able to protect an entire city from the most powerful army of its time, what can't He do for you? This story isn't just about Jerusalem. It's about your heart, your life, and your battles. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He has not changed. Moreover, the way He acted was extraordinary. The angel of the Lord, sent by God, wiped out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. It wasn't by swords or human strategies. It was by the word of the Lord. This kind of divine intervention not only saved a city but also demonstrated to the world that no one can challenge God's power and prevail. Have you ever recognized divine protection in your life? Perhaps in something like being saved from a car accident or avoiding a robbery. Know that just as God cared for Hezekiah and Jerusalem, He is also caring for you. What must it be like to lead a nation in spiritual and moral ruins? That was the scenario when Hezekiah ascended to the throne of Judah. The people had drifted away from God, the temples were filled with idols, and the heart of the nation seemed to have forgotten the living God. But Hezekiah was different. He decided to change the course of his people, not with empty speeches or conventional policies, but with genuine faith and bold actions. From the start of his reign, Hezekiah made courageous decisions. He didn't sit idly by, waiting for things to improve on their own. On the contrary, he tackled the problem head-on. The Bible records in 2 Kings 18 verses 3 to 6 that he did what was right in the eyes of God. And do you know what that meant? Destroying the high places, breaking the idolatrous pillars, and even destroying the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the desert, because the people had begun worshiping it as an idol. Think about it. He wasn't afraid to confront wrong traditions, even if they were popular. This courage came from a heart fully committed to God. Hezekiah believed in a God who deserved true worship, without distractions or deviations. Does that remind you of what Jesus said in John 4 verses 23 to 24? The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Hezekiah lived out this principle centuries before, showing that a faithful heart can transform not only a life but an entire nation. And it wasn't just in spiritual reform that he excelled. He understood that renewing the faith of the people needed to be a collective movement. Did you know that he restored the temple and called all of Judah and Israel to celebrate Passover? This is recorded in 2 Chronicles 30, where we see a leader who not only commanded but inspired. He called the people to repent and return to the Lord. Even those who had mocked at first were eventually moved by the sincerity of the king and the manifestation of God's power. Now, here's something interesting. Hezekiah wasn't perfect, but he was persistent. He faced resistance, mockery, and opposition, yet he never gave up on what he believed. Isn't that an example for you? Sometimes, renewing your own spiritual life or leading others in faith requires courage to let go of old habits, confront mistakes, and embrace what is right, even when it seems difficult. Speaking of challenges, Hezekiah faced one of the greatest tests of his life during the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. Assyria, led by Sennacherib, was the greatest empire of that time, known for its brutal conquests and its strategy of destroying the morale of nations even before attacking. And now, this war machine was at the gates of Jerusalem. Sennacherib wasted no time trying to demoralize Hezekiah and the people. He sent his messengers with words full of arrogance and mockery. If you read 2 Kings 18 verses 17 to 37, you'll notice the tone of the threats. He claimed that trusting in God was useless and that no nation had escaped the power of Assyria. He even mocked Hezekiah for destroying the idols, insinuating that this would weaken divine protection. Imagine the impact of such words on the hearts of an already besieged city. But here's the crucial detail. Hezekiah did not succumb to fear. Instead of caving to the pressure, he chose to trust in God. This trust wasn't theoretical or just words. It was practical. He sought the counsel of the prophet Isaiah, someone with a direct connection to God. Moreover, Hezekiah took the Assyrian threats to the temple and presented them before the Lord in prayer. He acknowledged that the battle was not just against a human enemy but against the very name and glory of God. Have you ever been in situations where the pressure felt overwhelming? Maybe a problem at work, a family crisis, or even an internal struggle. Like Hezekiah, the key lies in where you place your trust. He could have sought political alliances or tried to negotiate with the Assyrians, but he chose to kneel before God, knowing that only he could save Jerusalem. And this story isn't just about faith, it's also about leadership. Despite the fear that must have gripped the people, Hezekiah remained calm and led his nation with determination. He strengthened the city walls, secured the water supply, and encouraged the people not to be afraid. This combination of practical action and trust in God is a powerful example of how we should face our own battles. But the most astonishing part of this story was yet to come. When all seemed lost, God acted in a supernatural way. What happened next was not just a military victory. It was a clear demonstration that the Lord is the true king. At this moment, Isaiah, a prophet chosen by God, became a great messenger in the life of Hezekiah and the people of Judah. He wasn't just an advisor or a wise man. Isaiah was the voice of God in the midst of one of the most terrifying crises Jerusalem had ever faced. When Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, bringing threats of destruction and mocking the God of Israel, fear gripped the city. But it was during this time that Isaiah emerged as an instrument of comfort and direction. While Hezekiah sought answers in prayer, Isaiah received direct messages from God to reassure and strengthen the king and the people. In Isaiah 37 verses 6 to 7, he delivers one of the most encouraging words. Do not be afraid because of the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, and he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Do you see the impact of this message? It wasn't a military strategy, a complex plan, or a vague promise. It was the assurance that the Almighty God was in control. Isaiah demonstrated that even in the face of an overwhelming threat, God never abandons those who trust in him. Moreover, he revealed that true power doesn't lie in armies or kings, but in the hands of God. Now think about this. How does this apply to your life? Perhaps you're facing challenges that seem impossible to overcome. Sometimes, God sends a word through someone, a message, a prayer, or even a Bible verse that stands out to you. Isaiah is proof that God speaks, especially in moments when everything seems to be falling apart. But Isaiah wasn't just a bearer of good news. He also challenged the people and leaders to remain faithful to their covenant with God. Even before the Assyrian siege, Isaiah was preaching about repentance and faithfulness. His ministry was marked by visions and powerful messages. He was a man who lived in God's presence, and his life was one of continuous dedication to the divine purpose. During the siege, Isaiah played a crucial role in helping Hezekiah understand that the battle wasn't just physical but spiritual. The king needed to trust fully in the Lord, and Isaiah was there to remind him of this at every moment. Imagine the weight of this responsibility, to be God's channel at such a decisive moment in Israel's history. But Isaiah didn't falter because he knew the power didn't come from him but from the one who had called him. In the end, Isaiah's word was fulfilled in an extraordinary way. The Lord intervened supernaturally, showing that his promises are unchanging. After so many threats, mockery, and a city under siege, God decided to act in a way that left no doubt about who truly controls history. He sent his angel to supernaturally eliminate 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. Yes, in one night. Imagine waking up to find an entire army destroyed, without a single sword being lifted by human hands. This intervention is recorded in 2 Kings 19 verse 35, one of the most remarkable accounts in the Bible. The text says, "That night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies." There's no doubt, it was a direct act of God, without human interference. This event wasn't just a victory for Jerusalem. It was a clear message to the world that the God of Israel is sovereign and invincible. Now, let me ask you, why did God choose to intervene in such a dramatic way? First and foremost, because he is faithful to his promises. Hezekiah placed complete trust in the Lord, seeking his help in prayer and acting in faith. God, in turn, honored that trust. Furthermore, Sennacherib's blasphemies against God were met with a decisive response. When an arrogant king challenges the Creator, the outcome will never favor the challenger. But what does the angel of the Lord mean? In the Bible, angels often appear as messengers and warriors, acting on God's behalf. In many cases, the expression "the angel of the Lord" indicates a special manifestation of the divine presence, such as with Moses at the burning bush, Exodus 3 verse 2. Regardless, the intervention in Jerusalem was a demonstration that God uses his heavenly forces to protect his people and fulfill his purposes. Now think about this. Do you believe that God still intervenes in this way today? Perhaps not as visibly or dramatically, but he continues to act on behalf of those who trust in him. How many times have we heard stories of deliverance, healing, and provision that can only be explained as the hand of God? The same God who acted in Jerusalem is still in control of the impossible situations we face. And do you know what's even more amazing? The divine intervention in this story wasn't just to save Jerusalem. It was to reaffirm that the battle doesn't belong to us but to the Lord. This reminds us of David's words when facing Goliath in 1 Samuel 17 verse 47. "And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Like Jerusalem, you may also face battles that seem impossible. But Hezekiah's story proves that God is capable of acting supernaturally at the right moment. The story of Hezekiah and Jerusalem's deliverance also teaches us profound lessons about faithfulness and faith that can transform the way we face our own battles. Hezekiah was not just a king. He was an example of how a heart dedicated to the Lord can move mountains, or in this case, defeat an entire army without lifting a sword. The central point of this story is Hezekiah's unwavering trust in God, even when every circumstance pointed otherwise. Imagine being surrounded by the most powerful army of the time, constantly hearing threats of destruction, and still choosing to kneel in prayer rather than surrendering to despair. That is something few could do. Hezekiah understood that the battle was not his but the Lord's, and he decided to place his entire trust in him. This perfectly reflects what is written in Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." Hezekiah's trust was not passive. He didn't just wait for God to solve everything. On the contrary, he acted wisely and prepared Jerusalem for the siege, strengthening the city walls and securing the water supply. This teaches us that trusting God doesn't mean crossing our arms, but doing our part while completely relying on him. Faith and action go hand in hand. And what about reflecting on God's faithfulness? The Lord not only answered Hezekiah's prayers but did so in such an extraordinary way that it was clear to everyone that he was in control. When the angel of the Lord destroyed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a declaration that God is faithful to his promises and never abandons those who trust in him. Now think about your own life. How many times have you faced situations that seemed impossible? Perhaps a financial problem, an illness, or even a spiritual crisis. Like Hezekiah, you too are called to trust the Lord with all your heart. This means giving him your worries, acting wisely, and waiting for divine intervention at the right time. This story also teaches us that faithfulness to God isn't measured only in moments of crisis, but in how we live daily. Hezekiah didn't start seeking God only when danger arrived. He already had a life of communion with the Lord, and that made all the difference when challenges came. For us, this means cultivating a daily relationship with God through prayer, reading the Bible, and obeying his word. Hezekiah's reign was also a turning point for the people of Judah, not just because of military victories or the overcoming of crises, but because of the spiritual and cultural impact he left behind. Hezekiah wasn't merely a king focused on politics. He was a leader dedicated to bringing the people back to their covenant with the Lord, which bore fruit for generations. One of Hezekiah's primary actions was the restoration of the temple. When he ascended to the throne, Judah was in spiritual ruin. Previous kings had neglected the temple, allowing it to fall into disrepair and permitting idolatrous practices to spread throughout the nation. But Hezekiah acted swiftly. He summoned the priests and Levites, purified the temple, and restored worship to the Lord, as recorded in 2 Chronicles 29. Imagine the impact this had on a people who had lost their connection to God. This demonstrated that true worship must be a priority during times of crisis. Hezekiah also did something extraordinary. He called all the people, including the northern tribes, to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem, as described in 2 Chronicles 30. This was more than a religious celebration. It was a call to spiritual unity. Passover, symbolizing Israel's deliverance from Egypt, was renewed as a moment of repentance and reconciliation. Despite mockery and refusals from some, many responded to the invitation, resulting in a spiritual revival that brought joy and renewal to the people. Culturally, Hezekiah's reign was also significant. He brought stability and reinforced the identity of the people as God's nation. By destroying idols and forbidding the worship of false gods, Hezekiah re-established the spiritual values that should guide Judah. This return to the essence of their covenant with God not only impacted the people's spirituality but also influenced their culture and way of life. Another important point was Hezekiah's example of leadership. He showed that a leader doesn't just govern, he inspires. His firm actions, combined with his unwavering trust in God, gave the people courage and hope even in uncertain times. This teaches us that when we place God at the center of our decisions, the impact extends far beyond ourselves. It reaches those around us. Now think about what all of this means for us today. Just as Hezekiah restored the temple and called the people to worship, we are challenged to rebuild areas of our lives that may have drifted away from God. It could be your prayer life, your commitment to the church, or the way you share your faith. Hezekiah's reign reminds us that true renewal begins with a heart willing to seek God. But the question is, how can a leader faithful to God balance spirituality with practical and strategic decisions? Hezekiah is a brilliant example of how faith and action can go hand in hand. During his reign, he faced real and tangible threats, such as the Assyrian advance, but he did not rely solely on prayer. He used wisdom and planning to protect the people and ensure that Jerusalem was prepared for the challenges ahead. Assyria, under Sennacherib's command, was the most feared power of the time. Its armies were known for their brutality and efficiency, and their reputation for devastation caused panic throughout the region. Against such an imposing enemy, Hezekiah knew that faith was essential but also understood the need for action. One of his most notable measures was the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel, an advanced system to ensure Jerusalem's water supply during a siege. This tunnel, described in 2 Kings 20 verse 20, was an impressive engineering feat for its time, diverting water from the Gihon spring into the city walls. To this day, the tunnel remains archaeological evidence of Hezekiah's strategic preparation. In addition, he reinforced Jerusalem's walls, built defensive towers, and produced weapons and shields to strengthen the army. But what sets Hezekiah apart from other kings is that he never relied solely on these preparations. His primary dependence was on God, as we see when he brought Sennacherib's threatening letters to the temple and prayed fervently. This teaches us that planning and action do not exclude the need to trust in God. On the contrary, they must work together. Another fascinating aspect is how Hezekiah dealt with the psychological impact of war. Sennacherib not only attacked militarily but also waged a war of words to demoralize the people of Jerusalem. He sent messengers who, in full view of the city walls, delivered messages of fear, claiming that no God had saved other nations and that trusting in Hezekiah and the God of Israel was useless. 2 Kings 18 verses 19 to 25. Instead of succumbing to panic, Hezekiah responded with calm and faith, instructing the people not to listen to the provocations. His leadership was crucial in maintaining the people's unity and confidence. Now think about your life. How many times have you faced challenges that required both practical action and faith? Hezekiah reminds us that God calls us to do our part, whether it's studying for an exam, seeking help in difficult times, or making careful decisions in complicated situations. He also reminds us that, in the end, victory comes from God, even when we use the tools and abilities He has given us. Hezekiah also shows us that true wisdom lies in recognizing that all human ability must be submitted to divine direction. And the impact of this combination of faith and strategy echoes to this day, inspiring us to trust in God while using the resources we have at our disposal. But why does God choose to act in such extraordinary ways? Hezekiah's victory over the Assyrian army is an impressive example of how God intervenes on behalf of His people. But this story isn't isolated. Throughout the Bible, we see several divine interventions that follow a pattern. When everything seems lost, God manifests to show His sovereignty and faithfulness. Comparing these moments with Jerusalem's deliverance helps us better understand God's character and what He expects from us. Think, for instance, of the crossing of the Red Sea in Exodus 14. The Israelites were trapped between the Egyptian army and the sea. From a human perspective, there was no way out. But God made a path where there was none, allowing His people to pass safely while simultaneously destroying their enemies. What makes this event so similar to Hezekiah's story is the fact that, in both cases, the people didn't need to fight physically. God took the lead and showed that He is the one who grants victory. Another moment echoing the divine intervention in Jerusalem is the fall of Jericho's walls, recorded in Joshua 6. Here, God instructed the Israelites to march around the city for 7 days, trusting Him to bring down the walls. Just like during the Assyrian siege, the victory was clearly an act of God, demonstrating that battles are won through faith and obedience, not human strength. These events, and many others, such as Gideon's victory with only 300 men against the Midianites, have something in common. God acts so that His people understand that the glory belongs to Him. This is something we see clearly in Hezekiah's story. When the angel of the Lord destroyed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, it became evident that the victory was not the result of military strategies or human strength, but of divine intervention. God acts this way to strengthen His people's faith and to make His name known among the nations. There's another important similarity. All these stories were born out of a relationship of trust and obedience. Moses, Joshua, Gideon, and Hezekiah were not perfect, but they had something in common. They turned to God in times of crisis, sought His guidance, and trusted His promises. This teaches us that the starting point for experiencing God's power is our faith and surrender to Him. Now look at your own life. How many times have you faced situations that seemed impossible? These biblical accounts show us that God hasn't changed. He still acts on behalf of those who trust in Him, often in ways we don't expect. Like Hezekiah, Moses, or Joshua, we are called to surrender our battles to God and wait for His interventions. What can you learn from these powerful stories? God is faithful and acts on behalf of His people, but He expects you to trust Him and do your part. Hezekiah's story teaches us that in the face of challenges, we must bring our battles to God, just as he did, placing everything in prayer and acting wisely. No matter the size of the problem, God is capable of intervening in your life in a supernatural way. God is still writing your story. Place all your trust in Him and have faith. Everything will be okay. God bless you.